right. Howdy friends and anglers. Dan Rice here, signing in from the Riverfeet Fly Tying Saloon. Tonight we are going to be tying up one of my all-time favorite fly patterns. This is one I've been tying and fishing for more than 20 years. Warm water species, cold water species. It's a super fun, fairly challenging pattern to tie that looks quite realistic and fishes exceptionally well. It's the deer hair dragonfly. Dragonflies are one of the most overlooked aquatic insects by fly anglers. Now think about it. The nymphs themselves live in the water, crawling around on rocks or even swimming through the water column. They have a biological process called hydrojet propulsion, which means basically they inhale a little bit of water and kind of shoot it out their rear end. So they do like a scooting. So they, unlike other aquatic insects, or the majority of other aquatic insects, can swim quite well through the water column. So they're being seen by fish in different sections of the river. They're crawling around our rocks. They're hydrojet propulsing through that central sections of the water column, especially in lakes. And then they live as nymphs for about 2 years, depending on environmental conditions in your region. And then when they emerge, similar to stoneflies, they crawl out on nearby rocks or logs, shed their final nymphal skin, and crawl out as adult winged dragonflies, where they will live for anywhere from 30 days to 2 or 3 months. And what's super cool about dragonflies, they're a giant meaty morsel for fish. So you know, the nymphs are going to range anywhere from 1 inch to up to 2 inches long, and that's a nice big chewy meal. That's like 10 to 20 mayfly nymphs in one bite, right? So if you're a fish, whether you're a bass, smallmouth, largemouth, or you're trout, you're a carp, you're any other, I've caught northern pike on dragonfly nymphs. So, but today we're going to tie the adult. We're tying the deer hair dragonfly adult. Now these things, once they emerge from the river, they're buzzing around for a minimum of 30 days, unless of course they get eaten or die, whatever, etc. So the life cycle as the adult dragonfly lasts about 30 days. And during that time, they're coming into contact with the surface of the water, whether it's a river or a lake. Now that can happen in one of 3 ways. It can be they're diving, so dragonflies are carnivorous, right? So they're eating small insects like midges and mosquitoes and other bugs that are flying around. So they're constantly buzzing around, catching food out of the air. Interesting side note, dragonflies are the only creature in nature that can achieve a true hover. And now how a true hover was decided to be gauged was to be able to maintain perfect isostasis on the vertical, the horizontal, and the dimensional plane for 3 seconds minimum. Hummingbirds come close. Dragonflies are the only creature in nature that can achieve a true hover. And they'll oftentimes, as adults, make contact with the surface of the water. So whether they're chasing a bug, here's the surface of the water, chasing a bug, overshoot, bam, make contact, or there's an insect emerging from the water, a mayfly hatching, drying its wings, goes down to pluck it off. They get caught in that surface film and they wiggle around, become easy food for a fish. Dragonflies also have to drink, right? I mean, they're living for 30 days or more. They need to hydrate. So they'll go down and they'll dip and grab a drink, dip and grab a drink. Sometimes they dip a little too hard, get stuck in that surface film, buzz around, flap their wings, float along, get eaten by a fish. The third time that they're making contact with the water as adults is when the female comes in for her oviposit stage. So that's where you'll see them, and they'll kind of arch that tail back up like so, and they'll dip. And when they're doing that, they're depositing eggs with each dip. Dip, dip, dip. Those eggs settle to the bottom, incubate, hatch, become nymphs. The cycle continues. So anywhere you see dragonflies flying, fish will eat them. I've caught beautiful, gorgeous, good-sized rainbow trout on the Yellowstone River when I lived in Livingston on adult dragonflies. One of my favorite secret patterns to fish there was the dragon dropper. From about mid-June through late August, there's an abundance of dragonflies, Paradise Valley. And I would fish my adult dragonfly and drop a dragonfly nymph. Same concept as your hopper dropper, except you're using the same species both on top and on bottom. I don't mind sharing that little tidbit with you since I'm no longer living near the Yellowstone. I can give those secrets away. Like I said, I've also caught northern pike on nymphs. Now fish are opportunistic, right? This was a 36-inch northern pike that took an 1.5 inch long dragonfly nymph. Think about it as being a grown man, right? I want to eat that steak dinner, but you start throwing Pringles at me throughout the day. I'm going to grab one and I'm going to snack on it. I'm going to snack on it, waiting for that steak dinner. So that's the same thing with big fish eating nymphs. I've caught just a plethora of largemouth bass and smallmouth bass on adult dragonflies. Crappie, sunfish. Caught a walleye dead drifting a dragonfly nymph in the Cowishiway River up near Ely, Minnesota when I lived up there and frequented the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. So ask yourself, if you aren't fishing with dragonflies yet, what's stopping you? This is going to have an extended deer hair body. So what you're going to need something like a sewing needle or a paper clip. I use these, they're actually, I get them out of the jewelry section at Michael's. They're like little pins with what look kind of like hook eyes on one end. I also use these for making my own extended, or rather articulated fly shanks. Get a whole pack of like 200 of them for about $2, so pretty slick. So you're going to need something that's at least 1.5 inches long. Longer is okay, longer is better. And super slim, super narrow. Think no wider at max the width of the diameter of your hook shank. And you're going to get that set in your vise. You can make your dragonfly just about any fishy color. Now you can try to mimic the colors of the ones you see on your local waters. I'm going to tie a chartreuse one, mostly because I've never tied a chartreuse one. So the first thing we're going to do, you're going to get your thread. I like to use a clear mono thread for these because that mono is super rigid for working with deer hair, and it's pretty much transparent, so when it goes on to our extended body you don't see it. If you don't have a clear mono thread, don't sweat it, go with contrasting color. So like if you're using a chartreuse or a blue or a red deer hair, black's a good choice. If you're using a black thread, you can go black and hide it, or you can contrast it with a different color thread. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch out about 7 inches of my thread, and I'm going to tie just a quick little slip knot on that. So to do that, I just take the tag end, wrap it around 2 fingers, turn it twice, and then this part we're just basically finishing a complete clinch knot. It's essentially what we're doing is we're making a complete clinch knot that we will then use as a slip knot up around that extended body shank. So got my slip knot on there. This clear stuff's very hard to see in the lighting, but it's right there on my finger. I'm going to pull it up onto my extended body shank and slide it up till it's snug. And then I'm going to trim off most of this tag end. I don't want to trim it all the way off because as I start wrapping you might pull through some of that knot a little bit. Okay, and then you want your thread hanging pretty close. You want, I'm going to call it a minimum of 1/4 inch from the nose of your vise to where your thread's hanging. We're going to need a deer hair stacking tool. And then we're going to take a clump you want, and we're going to cut off. We're going to call it about a pencil diameter of hair. And you want to trim that down as close to the skin as you can get it. And we want to line this up so the tips are all the same length. So you got to work those tips down into your hair stacker. So I got all my hairs down in that stacker, and then I'm going to take that and tap it on a hard surface, fly tying desk, whatever. And you can see they've all pretty much sunk in there now. I'm going to pull out the few strays, and then we can remove it. And if we did this right, we should have just the tips ready to expose. I take the butt end of my bodkin and just lightly tap it through until I can get at those. Bam. And we're going to start with, we'll call it again, maximum of a 1/4 inch of those fur tips sticking out to the left, so towards the rear of this hook, or this hook shank, this extended body shank. And we're going to take those and we're going to try to wrap them around so your extended body shank is in the middle of all those fibers. And you're going to want to have a good 1.5 to 2 inches of thread hanging out, and give it one really loose wrap, 2, and then we're going to go with a 1/3. Don't put too much pressure on it until you get at least to that 1/3, and hold it snug, nice and centered, and then start to pull. That deer hair is going to flare. You ever worked with deer hair before, you know this, the hollow core causes it to flare a lot. Hold that in place while I stretch out some good 7-8 inches of thread, and then I'm going to just do a one-handed half hitch up and over all those materials. Pull it right down into place. Bam. So now what we're going to do, we're going to work our thread inside so it's underneath the fur, and so the thread is making direct contact to that extended body shank. We're going to get one wrap around that shank, no more than one wrap, just one loose wrap, not a tight wrap, before bringing the thread back up over the fur. And as we're working towards my right, as I'm right-handed, as we're working towards what would be the hook eye end, each segment we create will get a little bit wider. So this first one, I'm going to pull it through that fur, give it one wrap on that shank, and then get it aligned where I want my first segment to be. Pull that fur out, hold that in place, and do the same thing. Loose wraps, 1, 2, and then that 3rd one before pulling it tight. Just make sure you got all those hairs nicely caught. And then I'm going to snug it down. Bam. Okay. Then I'm going to do that same thing again, going up. Create my next segment a little bit longer this time. As snug as I can. 1, 2, 3. Pull it tight. Okay. And we're going to do that same thing. We want to now, on this segment, let's throw another half hitch on. Every other segment, throw a half hitch on. And get my thread back in the middle. Prep my next segment. Okay, get that thread, and again, 3 loose wraps, pull it tight. Now I'm going to give it another half hitch as we're getting closer to the end. So I always like to have a minimum of 4 segments, depending on the length of the fur you're using. You can go as many as 6. 1, 2, 3. Pinch it, stretch it. Don't worry about all that fraying look. We're going to trim that up at the end. And that's just on account of there being different lengths of fur in this clump, which is going to happen with deer hair. Okay, get another nice half hitch on there. Bam. Okay. Now, what you're going to want to do, get that half hitch pulled pretty snug, get your thread up to where it's got maybe an inch, inch and a half dangle, and we're going to slide, hold your bobbin in one hand and slide that extended body slow and easy. Sometimes you got to kind of twist it and wiggle it and pull it right off your extended body shank. Now we can remove our extended body shank and get your hook. For this one I am using an Eagle Claw plain shank size 6. You can use any brand of hook you have. Make sure it's a good quality hook. These flies will catch some big fish, so you want a hook that's beefy enough to handle it. The most important thing, we want a hook shank that's somewhere between, we'll call it 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 of an inch. And then we want a good size hook gap too. Again, that's a little over 1/4 inch on the hook gap. Now that gap's important because this deer hair body is going to poof up a little bit and it's going to fill in some of that gap. So you want to make sure you got enough hook gap remaining to get a hook set. And then we're going to take our extended body, we're going to hold it up, thread on the far side of the hook, get that extended body right where the shank meets the bend. So you don't want it down on the bend, but you don't want it like fully up into the shank. And then you're going to take and you're going to wrap some wraps in the front of that. Do 2 wraps in front and underneath that fur. Then bring it around back. Do 1. 2 more. Okay, now with this one I'm going to capture not all of that fur, but I'm going to capture some of that fur towards the front. Pull it down, and that will help bind it to the hook, so now we don't have the twist. And then I'm going to take these fibers, these fur fibers, and just work them back, put a handful of wraps right there. Now I'm just going to bring my thread up towards my hook eye just to get it out of the way. I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to clean this up a bit. So all these fur butt ends that are sticking out from where we just tied on, I'm going to trim them down so they're just slightly, building a slightly larger diameter than that last segment on the extended body. And while I'm at it, I'm going to trim off those fur pieces, butt ends that are sticking out of the extended body. I'm going to bring that thread back to right where the fur starts. And I'm going to put just a little bit of glue on the thread, cover, we'll just call it a 1/2 inch of thread with your glue of choice. Put a little bit right on there. And we want to really seal that extended body in place, so if a fish jumps up and grabs just the body and you strip hook set the other direction, it doesn't yank it off. So I'm just going to wrap that glue right in through this fur, get one behind, and bring it right back in there. So I'm going to use this J. Farrar synthetic blend. It's got a little bit of flash built into it and it's kind of a light dun gray. You want it to be able to extend. A good ballpark is making your wings each from each side the same length as your extended body. That way everything looks to stay in proportion. You don't have to cut it to length yet, just make sure you've got enough to reach your target. So I've got a little clump like so, and I'm gonna tie that in place here using some crossover wraps, figure 8 wraps. Hold that in, and we want that on the top of the hook shank, butting up towards where that fur is tied in place. Then you want your thread as tight to the front end of that wing case as you can get it. I'm going to go ahead and even up my wings. And I like to create kind of a natural taper in the wings. So I'm going to mark the length where I want it and just cut an angle up each side. Get a good inch and a half of thread hanging out. And then we're going to take a clump of deer hair. I'm going to call it about a little more than a pencil diameter worth of deer hair. Get rid of the fluff. And then I like to trim it down a bit right now. There's no reason to stack this portion. We're just spinning it right here. So I'm just going to trim it down a bunch. And I'm going to take that clump and I'm going to split it approximately half and half on each side of the hook shank. And then bring my thread around and grab it all. 1 loose wrap, 2 loose wrap, pull. Okay, and then I'm going to bring up my thread. I'm going to move slightly towards the front of the hook and work it through some more of those fur fibers just to get another little grab on there. And then bring that thread down to the hook shank, pull it tight again, stack that deer hair back as much as you can. And I have learned that it's easier with something like this to trim as I go rather than waiting until the end to trim. So I'm going to throw a quick half hitch in my thread just in case I accidentally nick it. Get that up and out of the way. And then being careful not to cut my thread or my wings. I'm going to trim this deer hair down to where it's again a bit larger diameter than the tail, the extended body portion. I'm not going to shape it perfectly yet. I'm just kind of starting to build that form. Okay, so we want to be able to get one more clump of deer hair right on the front there. So keeping that thread pretty tight to your last clump, and pull out a good 1.5 inches, 2 inches of thread so you're ready. And you know, you just have to kind of judge how much space you have left on the hook shank. I can tell I don't have quite enough for as large of a clump as the last one, so I'm going to go just shy of the diameter of a pencil's worth of fur. Doing that same thing, split the difference over, do 2 loose wraps up around that fur. Hold it in place with your left hand and pull it down and let it spin. And then I'm going to try to evenly distribute it around each side of the hook and push it back. Stack it. Work a wrap up through some of that fur again. Binding it down a little bit. And then work your way with the thread down to where it's grabbing just the hook shank. Okay. Have my hook eye exposed. Deer hair spun on there. I'm going to pull that back and get a few wraps right in the very front there, and then then I'm going to go ahead and do another half hitch there so I don't accidentally nick it while I'm trimming. Put that thread all the way up tight to the hook shank again, less chance of nicking it. And I'm going to start trimming, forming the head of the dragon, here. I'm going to give that thread a couple more tight wraps right there, and then I'm going to pull it back to where it's just slightly back into that fur and work it down gently through it. So for hook eyes, I use this bead chain stuff, and we just want 2 of them. Again, color's not really super important here. It's sort of user's choice. I like red because it stands out. And we're going to hold that in place. I like to hold it across the far side, aiming at me, which is going to make it hard for you to see on the camera here, but essentially what I'm going to do, I'm going to hold it in place right about where the thread is. I'm just going to do 1 figure 8. Don't want to do too many wraps inside of that fur. I'll go once over top, and you want to try to, when you're coming back, work your thread through that fur rather than pulling the fur down, if that makes sense. Then bring your thread back up in front of the fur to the hook shank behind the hook eye. Those eyes will inevitably pull some of the fur down and out of place, so just retrim that a little bit. Okay, I'm going to get a couple wraps right on that hook eye, and then we're going to go ahead and knot off. And we can whip finish right on that now. Another nice thing about this mono, the elasticity of it really kind of stretches into place, so it really snugs your knots down nicely. Right. Now we have our fly, and I'm a little OCD with this. I like to work on it with the scissors a bit more. I always got to remind myself that it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just going to go in a fish's mouth anyway, but we want it to look proportionate and balanced. We want to think symmetry. Right, there's your extended deer hair dragonfly. So I hope you enjoyed this demonstration. Tie one up, post pictures of them for me in the comments. I want to see how you did, and let me know if you catch some fish with these bad boys. All right, we'll see you down the stream.